Thank you very much, Alex. It's great to be back and doing another webinar. I always enjoy talking to people and sharing whatever I can in terms of my experiences around a particularly important topic of really how to be your best in what I call a formal interview. You know, so much of today in this restricted economy, there's a lot of talk about networking and informal interviews and how to network, and we want to really zero on here where there is a real job, something we are delighted to hear. In terms of kind of structure and agenda, I want to spend a little time talking about the interview and how this specific event itself fits into kind of a larger evaluation process. Then a little bit of time talking about how to prepare for the interview, what to do in terms of being kind of methodical and efficient in terms of really knowing what you're going into to talk about, knowing about the company, the person you're speaking with. Then some time really on the whole interaction during the interview, how to read the person that you're speaking with or the people, depending on how many interviews there are, and really managing what I call sort of the ebb and flow of the conversation. So much of this, you know, we can plan on, but a lot of it is proving to people that we can be nimble and that we can be flexible in terms of what comes up in what is essentially a conversation. I've also, I'm going to weave in some comments about recruiters, and again, many of us come to jobs in different ways, but I'm going to spend a little time throughout this mentioning specifically about how best to use them as kind of your advocates, and in many ways almost kind of like your reps, you know, people that are representing you. So a little bit about how to work with them, and then I'm going to finish up with just some general tips to kind of bring it together to a close about what to remember and what skill sets can really help you be effective in what I call in the room. As Alex mentioned at the end of the session, happy to answer any questions and answers or comments. If we do not have enough time to answer your questions, again, I'm happy to respond to them by email. On my last slide, you will see information about my firm, including my web address as well as email. And again, I welcome your questions, or if you want copies of the PowerPoint, I am delighted to share them with you. So hopefully that will give you kind of a lay of the land of where I'm going. So some of this is fairly straightforward, but I want to really sort of zero on what an interview is. And it's, you know, it's a situation where there is an active position with stated requirements for which you are being considered. Now, the thing that's interesting also is, you know, how active, how much active is, does that mean that it's newly posted? There's different versions of what active could mean, but we're talking about a real job and someone who has somehow expressed interest in putting you into a larger evaluation process. And what I wanted to mention was that many times we may have very clear requirements and specs, as I call them, of the job. In other cases, we may be given verbal information, and it may be up to us to define it more in the interview. So what we're starting with may vary in terms of specificity. I also want to mention that this is part of a larger evaluation process, and I'll get into a little later about sort of the metaphor of a race, meaning your job is to get from event to event, meaning the only time you will have to be in front of your potential person that you might be working with. Importantly also is to recognize what it is not. And again, many people, you know, we are often socialized to prepare and to impress. It's not an opportunity to boast knowledge, certainly not a monologue. You know, many of us, when we're nervous or perhaps on edge, tend to talk too much, certainly understandable. By the same token, if you switch gears, it's also not a time for you to be interrogating your interviewer. There should be a balance in terms of the conversation between you and them. And what I like to say is, it's kind of a change in mindset, because I think many times a lot of pressure is being put on people to make this a performance. And what I'd like to think of it is, let's think of this as moving from a performance to a relationship-building conversation. And you see how different that is? That's much more about establishing rapport and less about being sort of a polished, scripted candidate. So when you look fundamentally at the interview, why do people hire you? And when I give a course on this, I always start, when I'm talking with interviewing, I always say there's 3 things that you need to prove. One is you can do the job. That is, you have the skills. You may need to have the right kinds of skills or facility in certain areas. You want to do the job. How many of us have been in interviews where we are totally qualified and we come across as extremely neutral? I won't say bored, but I'll say going through the motions. So wanting to do the job. And then the third area, which is probably the most subjective and hardest, is, are you a good fit? Do you fit the culture? And that's something that, again, we'll talk a little later about this, about sort of understanding from both your end and their end if you would be happy finding a home here. But your job as you move forward in this process is ultimately to prove these 3 things. So let's talk about, if we use this as a mission statement, it would be, if this was your business plan, it would be to prove convincingly and authentically that you are the best candidate for the job. And again, sounds fairly straightforward, but I want to emphasize those 2 words in italics, because convincingly to me means proof with concrete examples, that you really have something to back up and not generalizations. And by authentic, I mean that it sounds like you, that it's not a pre-canned script that tells me what you think I want to hear. As Alex mentioned, I do a lot of work at Columbia, and when I'm in corporate America, when I was back working at companies, I worked and did a lot of recruiting, and I remember being in those little offices where you have a half an hour and you see like 11 people, and they're trying to get callbacks, and I felt like, is there anyone here that has anything that's different or not a sort of scripted MBA answer? And so I want to say that bring your personality and bring your if you have a sense of humor to it, something that's you and not something that is again so tightly written that it is flat. So let's talk a little bit about before the interview. You want to get a full grasp of the job description. Sounds very obvious, but I've talked to many clients that have gotten everything from a written 2-page job description from a recruiter with really specific specs of what they're expecting and what the requirements are and the salary range, to people that have gotten phone calls the night before for a marketing job. I mean, look at the variation on that spectrum. So you're trying to get as much as you can ahead of time, and it may be that some of this you may not get ahead, and you may have to probe when you first arrive at your meeting. Who or whom you will be speaking with and their titles. Again, it may be an HR person that starts off with and says you're talking to a couple of marketing people. Understand, are these people that are, for instance, hierarchically one junior to the other? Are they in the same group? Are they people that might be potentially colleagues? But you need to get a sense of kind of the levels of these people, and you also need to understand how long you will have with them. Again, a very obvious question. Often if there are more than one, you will have a schedule. But understand, if you're talking to a senior person, how much time. And again, if this is not laid out, it often is helpful to say, when you get in there, I'd like to do a time check, just so you understand how much time. nothing worse than having your kind of finale ready and the person saying they have to see the next person. You also should really understand how this particular event, I'm going to call it, fits in with the full scope of the evaluation process. So, kind of where are we in the process? So a couple of different scenarios. I mean, it may be what I call an initial screening. A typically HR person, certainly probably not as technical maybe as some later interviews, but just as important, because this is the gatekeeper. This is the person that may see you as a better fit elsewhere. So important to be equally prepared for them at this first meeting. It could be that it's set up that it's a human resources screening and they've already gone ahead and lined up what I call line interviews, which are functional people right after you. So it may be 4 or 5 people in a row. Another thing could be a group interview, which typically happens during what I call callbacks, where you might have 4 or 5 people. I talked to one client that had like 5 interviews, and the last interview was with the very senior people. A short interview, an important one, but in many cases, unbeknownst to him, he was pretty much at the finish line, and this was more a formality. There can also be, another version can be the human resources person seeing you one day and then setting up the sequential interviews the next day, which is ideal because it gives you more time to prep and a little more rest. And then finally, the recruiter interview. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, but I want to also emphasize that understand also what medium you are going to be using. I mean, in many cases, this screening could be done initially on the phone if you're talking to someone out of state or even internationally. It might be in person with an HR person. I mean, this one client that I mentioned, for instance, was told that they would move into a conference room and it would be done by video conferencing with 4 people from across the country. So know what's expected and know certainly what technology needs to be done. In most cases, if it's done in their office, they will be in charge, but it may be that you are doing a phone conference from home. So give yourself enough time to understand not only your message, but what your medium is. You need to be prepared comprehensively for all scenarios, and I want to talk a little bit especially, and I say including, but I say especially with recruiters. They are your advocate, and certainly they are earning a commission or a retainer or whatever, but with them, you need to be polished, just as you would be if you were with their client. You need to be sure of what you want in terms of is this if this job is right for you, why you want it, and what your motivation for going there is. You need to be honest. If you get in there and it's something that doesn't seem as interesting, better to have them know ahead of time than to go full force and get you in a situation that is what I call, again, inauthentic. And you need to be relationships oriented. These are people that you may want to be working with in the future. So these are people that you can confide in. You need to be honest about what you want. And what I will say is, this is just as important as a formal interview. And I know a lot of people go in kind of winging it and saying, this is just a recruiter, and it'll be fine. I mean, many of them will have times even harder interviews and longer interviews than you might get when you get to the company, because these are their clients. And they want to make sure that if they present someone, that it's a good client. So you may not even get over that hurdle if you're not presenting well to this person. In terms of preparation, and I'm going to divide this piece into 2 sections. One is what I call the quantitative work, and one is the qualitative work. Sort of the quantitative is fairly straightforward. It's any public information that might be websites, including documents or periodicals. And you want to get information about the firms, the background, the history, the structure, if there are subsidiaries, how these work together, the extent you can in terms of, for instance, if it's a consulting firm, is it across client, domains vertically? Is it across functional areas? How they're doing financially, their competitors, where they are in the marketplace. Are they an established brand? Are they kind of new, more entrepreneurial? And certainly their products and services. The comment I make to many people in preparing, and again, I'm always of the attitude to be better prepared than over-prepared, but I think there is a law of diminishing returns. And by this I mean, I've talked to many people the night before that spent a lot of time surfing the net and getting a lot of information. Be your own advocate and say, at what point do I have enough information that I can move forward to the qualitative? And I would say I would be spending more time, as much or more, on developing questions that get at that third piece that I was talking about. Remember, I talked about the culture and the fit. These are things that are not published. These are things that you're getting opinions, you're asking open-ended questions. You want to know about the culture. What is it like in terms of what to work there? Is there travel? What are the demographics of the people that work there? What are the career paths? Now, again, at different points in your conversations, it's certainly smart to ask the other person, I'm just curious if you could tell me a little bit about your career path here. People really like to tell their stories, and it could be very illustrative to find out what they enjoy and what they find a challenge. You want to know their industry reputation. Now, again, this is something that you may know sort of intuitively from the press, but perhaps they've worked at other competitors. What was it like to work, if you were in cosmetics, say, I see you worked at Estee Lauder. How did that vary in terms of where you are at versus Chanel? Again, you have to be the best judge of when to ask these, what I call these counter questions, because certainly your first job is to prove these first three things, but these are excellent questions to weave in throughout the evaluation process to see if there is a fit from your side. And the last piece is really how this position is in context with its department and larger organization. So for instance, is it a new job? Is it perhaps a consolidation of some other jobs? Is this a new department? Is this a cross-functional department? How does it fit in? Is it, for instance, is it a central group? Is it a profit center? I have one client that's in the legal area, and she is in a central corporate counsel situation, and she did not realize until she got to the interview that really her clients were the fellow bankers. Her clients were not the clients of the bank. So really important to understand, how this job fits in with the bigger picture. And again, this is something that may not be, in 2 or 3 paragraphs in an isolated job description. In terms of preparing, and I always say it's good to write these things down. Whether you keep them with you or not is up to you. And you'll notice these are in threes. There's no magic threes, but 3 things you most want them to know about you, your differentiation. What's going to set you apart? How am I going to remember Brad Ager, who I spoke to along with 12 other people? What about him and his background did I remember as being special? 3 things you want to know about them. Now, again, a lot of this information may be public, but if you only have a limited amount of time, a couple of questions that are really going to get at some of these qualitative aspects that I mentioned. And the third and probably hardest is the 3 questions you most dread, what I call your blind spots. And again, these are areas, there are things either about your past work, your experiences, perhaps gaps in your resume, a client that may have been a problem, things that are on your mind that you are self-conscious about. Now, I'm going to emphasize, many cases these questions are never asked. In this day and age, a gap of a year or 2 on a resume is not really a big deal, as long as you're honest and account for your time. So be prepared for these, but know, what areas in your resume, for instance, are harder for you to articulate, and just have them rehearsed. So during the interview, and again, pretty straightforward, in terms of dress, neutrally and professionally. Your headhunter, if you're working with them, may give a sense of sort of how formal these people are, but obviously the rule of thumb is err on the more formal side, maybe one notch above. Certainly arrive early. In the era of cell phones and texts, really calling to say I'm running late is really, unless under really bad circumstances, not an option. So better to have more time to kill than less. As you're waiting in reception areas, pay attention to the atmosphere, the details, the energy of the place. There's a lot you can glean from what I call sort of sensory observation and how people work. And the last is just in terms of sort of paperwork. Most of them are going to have your resume, but certainly good to have extra copies with you. And you may want to bring some of these notes with you and some writing materials. Many people ask, is it okay to take notes? It's up to you. I think the main thing is you do not want to lose the eye contact with someone, but you may want to jot down some things, and often it's permissible to say, would you mind if I just jotted down a couple of notes as we were speaking? Some people have great memories and leave the interview and can jot things down immediately, but there may be things that you want to remember. It's certainly not inappropriate. So as we're getting into the interview, there's this initial social rapport, and I don't quite think that people make a judgment. They say in 2 minutes they decide whether they want you or not. I don't think life is quite that cut and dry, but there is a certain amount of rapport. If, in fact, you've been referred by someone in common, there may be some discussion about that. There may be just some small talk. There may be something just to kind of start with kind of something social before you get into the hard nuts and bolts of the interview. The anatomy of the exchange, and the metaphor I use is the dance. Think about when you're dancing with someone. At some point, he or she may lead. At one point, you may lead. And what it is the two of you getting in sync with each other. Because let's say you probably may work together. So the idea of even this as a mirror of or a metaphor for your work, this could be really, really helpful. So be prepared, be flexible to the agenda order, and I'll talk a little bit about ways that one can begin these interviews, but be, as I said, nimble or able to really be flexible in terms of what's discussed first, or things may jump around a bit, be flexible. Read the interviewer's preferred communication style. You're going to get a sense pretty quickly if this is a broad-based person that talks a lot about the organization and speaks in sort of general tones. You may have someone early on who is much more about, tell me about this, tell me about that. Their style may be extremely specific. They may have combed your resume. So be prepared to reflect on back in the way they are comfortable getting information. And certainly the hardest thing of all is to listen more than you talk. Again, hard to say this, but allow them time in. So one scenario might be you lead with what you call your elevator pitch, and many of you, I'm sure, have heard this term, but the way I like to describe it in sort of shorthand terms is where I am now, where I'm coming from, and where I want to go. So you may get into the room, there may be sort of a pause or a silence. They may be testing you about your initiative. They may be shy, who knows. But a good way might be something like, would it help for me to give you a brief summary of my background? Now remember, these are your words. They're interested in hearing about you telling stories. They have your resume, they have the numbers, they know what percentage you increased sales, and they have the facts, but many of them are interested to hear you talk about it in kind of what I will call a narrative situation. this is an example that I put together, and again, this sounds fairly scripted, but it's a good example. I'm currently working as an account supervisor at Young & Rubicam, where for the last 5 years, I've worked on a number of accounts in the food, pharmaceutical, and liquor categories. Previously, I worked on the client side in credit card marketing for Citibank. I'm now interested in transferring my skills and experience to a sales marketing position in the cable television industry, blank, such as HBO or wherever you are. So it's a real kind of a thumbnail that gives them, again, sort of where you are at 3,000 feet. Now, that may not be the way it actually happens. Another scenario might be they jump in and they start talking about the organization and position requirements. And that is great. I mean, you know, there's power in information. You may not have gotten all these written specs ahead of time. You know, if it's been through your recruiter, hopefully they've earned their commission and done such. But if, again, it's been through some emails from an HR person that's busy, this is a chance for you to listen about these requirements and then to respond with questions, comments, and clarifications. So again, this is the back and forth that I talked about. And this is your chance in a natural way to weave in examples from your work history that match your stated needs. So the person might say, well, we're looking for someone specific with international experience. And you might say, I'm curious, you know, the international experience, what type of, is that around existing brands or new brands? And they might say, well, combination. You say, well, that's very interesting, and that reminds me of some of the work that I did when I was at Y&R on blank. So again, it's a natural conversation that falls out of basically seeing a need and fulfilling it. So some tips for the interview exchange. Remember, as diplomatic as you want to be, you are ultimately in charge. You want to respect your interviewer and be open to this ebb and flow, but always the conversations should be steered back to places that will allow you to be best evaluated. So if in a job description a lot of 70% of it is one area that you're really good in, certainly answer questions about the other 30%, but don't be afraid to revisit areas and, you know, if you haven't gotten a chance to really tell a full story, say, I'd like for a moment just to tell you a little bit, we didn't quite finish that, if it's okay, to go back to some of the other work I did. Again, it's not in perfect order, but you always want to be having enough airtime to show how you're the best candidate. There's something about the other person that's also very interesting, and I've been on both sides of the desk, but there are many people that are very bad interviewers. And I'm sure we've seen this, where we actually are probably better interviewees than they are better interviewers. How embarrassing. But they may not be good at this. They may be introverts. You may have caught them on a busy day. They may have been handed your resume 5 minutes ahead of time. You don't know where they're coming from, but you need to recognize that some may need to really be prompted. And some of this coaching, I call it, is a very sort of diplomatic way of helping them along in a very discreet way. So it might be something like, there's a pause in the conversation and you say something like, would it help for me to, at this point, tell you a little bit about my experience with international product launches? Again, it's an open-ended question. You're allowing them to answer it, but it may help better frame what you all are talking about. You also want to manage the person's speaking. They may pontificate about the organization. You have an hour, and you're already 40 minutes into the organization. You need to segue into talking about you so that you get enough airtime to prove those two first points that I mentioned earlier in the slides. When you're talking about your stories, and I keep putting stories in quotes because stories to me is sort of the colorful version of the resume of your accomplishments or what you've done. give them the appetizer, not the whole meal. You know, chances are your resume is fairly specific, but don't tell the whole story. Many of us, again, back to being nervous, will, they may ask you, well, tell me about what you did when you worked in Japan. Don't take them through every step. Give them a summary and then allow your interviewer to have room to ask follow-up questions about the details, the circumstances, what's happened within the story. So you want to give it a back and forth. It shouldn't be, as I said earlier, a lecture on what I did. You're going to lose them, quite frankly, as in terms of their awareness and their attention. So what about when tough questions come up? And these are invariably, these could be combinations of blind spots, but acknowledge them, answer them honestly, and steer the conversation back to areas of strength. So really be honest about, if you've been out of work for a while, tell the truth. There's always that class thing, what have you been doing? I've been doing consulting. Well, if you haven't been consulting, don't say that. Say, you have been doing some volunteer work, you've been actively looking for work, you've been dealing with personal issues, but tell the truth. And that's, what I'm saying is, there may be areas, for instance, around when you left a job exits, whether it was a downsizing, whether it was a parting of the ways that may be sensitive. There may be areas where some of the functions you did you're not as strong in as others, or they may drill down and start asking you, well, when you worked on this campaign, did you really have profit and loss responsibility, or were you more of an assistant? So be really clear on that, both in your resume and yourself, because if you try to fudge it, they're gonna find out. And if you don't meet those criteria, couch everything in a positive way. So you might say, I haven't really, to tell you the truth, done international marketing, but I will tell you that I did work with an export-import company as one of my clients previously, or I had some experience working with a shipping company. So, try to tie to something positive and use what I call forward-looking language. So if you don't have it, to assimilate new information. And finally, for any of these things, and I want to emphasize particularly when I work with people, the whole thing about leaving firms, don't over-explain. There's this need to say, well, then there was a downsizing, and, my boss left, and then 3 other people left, and we weren't sure what happened, and, give them just the real brief thing of what happened. There's no need to really over-explain. There's just a need to address the question honestly and in abbreviated form. The whole question of salary is a big one. Certainly, if you're dealing with a recruiter, there's a whole set of situations where you're able to be honest and describe what you're making, what you're looking for. You will have a conversation around the strategy and how that will happen, and that's really their domain, although it may come up in a conversation. What you're always trying to do is defer any mention of numbers until there is a mutual fit described. And it's kind of a cat and mouse game, I will say, but it's the answer is, I'd like to see if there's a fit, and then see, I'm sure we can work a mutually beneficial agreement out. Often, especially HR people, are just trying to make sure you're in the ballpark. So, another way to say if you're pressed is a level that is fair or competitive in the marketplace. Some clients have gone as far as to mention what they're currently making and then just stop. I think that's a little dangerous. It's honest, but again, it's kind of a poker game, and you want them to show a number first. I think if pressed even further, give a very wide range. So a little bit about closing the interview. And this is, again, you'll get a sense of this from the body language of the person you're speaking with. They may look at their watch. You can just get a sense of what's happening. save 1 or 2 questions about the firm or the position for part of the interview. I don't mean that they have to be the most important, but something to ask, to ask them back. And it's going to be the typical signal is going to be when the interviewer brackets the interview with something like, at this point, do you have any further questions for me? It's pretty obvious. They've gotten what they need. They still want to give you a little airtime, but they want to kind of wrap it up. Certainly reasonable to ask a couple of them. And the most important thing that many, many people do not do is do not leave this room without a full picture of the next steps in the evaluation process. Many people are so elated that it went well, maybe just happy that it's over, that they shake hands and make a good impression, and they get home and they go, I don't know what I'm really supposed to do next. So a way of getting at this is some interesting questions, which are, again, are very open-ended, very friendly, but you want information. So something like, for instance, could you tell me where you all are in the process of terms of speaking with other candidates? Where am I? Have you spoke to internal people first, and now you're doing external? Or do you have a couple of finalists? Get a sense of this. Could you describe the process in terms of callbacks? So am I in the first round, or are there, how is this going to proceed? Are you going to have people speak to, if you've had an initial interview, then people in the office and then people at, say, a central location? How is that going to work, particularly if you're in a branch office and there's, say, a home office? Does that involve some kind of travel or conference call? And then, particularly if you may have other things on the burner that are real and real jobs, may I ask what your estimated timing is in terms of getting someone in place for the position? Again, notice how there's permission here. May I ask, estimated. You're not trying to push them for an answer. You're trying to get some sense of where it is. Now, we know many people, these things go on hold. They're out of your control, maybe out of many of their controls. But you're trying to get a sense of when you can be in contact with them. 2 key and required statements. Do you at this point need anything else from me? It sounds pretty obvious. Some people have gone as far as to say, can you give me a sense of how I am as a candidate? Or, I tend to sort of err on not putting people on the spot like that. But the way the wording I have it here is, would you like a writing sample? Would you, what have I not proven to you, or whatever? And they may say, that's fine, we need everything we need, leave it at that. The other piece, and again, it doesn't have to be these exact words, but that you're enthusiastic about the next steps. How many people have gone through this thing? And again, a neutrality around, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed meeting. I look forward to talking to you. Some enthusiasm, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to tell them you will take this job, but there's enthusiasm in continuing. That's all you're saying. You're continuing the process. Remember that it's an event in a chain of events. After the interview, certainly the standard follow-up note. I want to emphasize not doing this as a canned, scripted, kind of off-the-book kind of, thank you very much for your time, I enjoyed meeting you, blah, blah, blah. All that wants to be conveyed, but you want to say why you are uniquely qualified for the position. It may be a few bullet points. And I often say then maybe just a quick reference to a salient project or accomplishment that came up during the conversation that will set you apart. So when the person reads this, back to this thing about international, say, oh, that's right, I remember now, that was Brad Agri, and he was the one that worked in France. So, something that's going to tie back to what you all talked about. And this is going to go into your file. So it's not something that's deleted. The follow-up phase, how to do this. This is the horrible part. This is like the actors, although I guess for the actors, they get dished and pushed off the stage and said, we'll call you. But get permission for future circle back dates. In other words, they may say, well, Brad, we're going to hire probably the 1st of April. And a great question I love to say is, if I have not heard back from anyone, meaning either on your staff, in your HR department, wherever, would it be permissible for me, when would be a good time to check back with you? So you're asking them permission to name a date. So, he says, well, you'll hear from me one way or the other. In this day and age, many of us do not hear unless good news. So nothing wrong with asking for a date to check in. You call on that date and say, you'd asked me to call you on the 10th of March, and I just wanted to check in. And you can also certainly do it by email. And of course, don't overcall. This is like, watering a plant until it dies. Really be aware that they have lots of other initiatives usually, and being over-aggressive does not always send the right message. Just a little bit about recruiters. If you're working with one, certainly you want to call them as soon as possible. They probably, if they're doing the job, will call you first, but you want to give them your frank opinion on what happened, your read on the people, how you felt you did, what your strengths were, kind of give them, and I think the sooner the better. Certainly when you get home and you've gathered your thoughts, that's great. They will probably say to you, then I'll get back to you with feedback. When they circle back to you, and I've been in this situation before where I've gotten feedback on a cell phone in a car, and it's like 5 minutes, make sure you get a full sense of feedback on what was actually transmitted from the client through them. How often things are changed in terms of translation. If you're not sure of what they mean by they see you as a strong candidate, probe further. Does that mean I'm a finalist? Does that mean I'm in the ballpark? Does that mean I'm one of many? Or they see you as not having one of the skills. Well, which one and why? So really, I'll be very honest, have them earn their commission on this, because you really want to know if there's still an issue that needs to be addressed. As I mentioned, also as you move forward, and if in fact you get to the point of an offer, let them handle the money. That's the best way. They're skilled at this. They know how to do this. Let them handle that. That's their one of their expertises. So just some final thoughts as you move forward. Have references ready, but never reveal them until you've had a chance to fully brief your contacts. Certainly, you're not going to list them, but certainly when you're asked for them, spend some time in coaching these people on the phone about the job, what they're looking for, a little bit about the firm. The more I have to go by, the better sense of what I can tell them, then the better it will be in terms of a conversation. The other thing is just to remember, certainly this is not a webinar on resumes, but certainly don't regurgitate it. The resume is kind of something that works for you on its own before and after the interview. It can be a reminder. It can be a prompt for the person talking to you. But it should not be, they have that. They want to hear what's between the lines, what happened, what your experiences were. But make sure that resume is tight, that it's chronological, that it's tightly edited, and that it's jargon-free. So if you're interviewing for another different industries, make sure that it's not overly technical. In terms of kind of strategy, back to what I was saying earlier, focus on the near term. Your job is to get called back for the next step in the process. So you're looking, just a couple of 100 feet ahead of you. You're not looking 3 miles ahead of you. Do not worry about what would I do if I got an offer. Your job is to get a next call back and to handle each of these events as best you can. And by event, I obviously mean interview. Tackle the long term when it comes. So if the offer does come, at that point, you're in the seat of power. You get the offer. You evaluate the terms. You respond, yes, no, you negotiate, and you make a decision. But that, again, is all a different skill and something that you should not be preoccupied with at this point. So it's really about focus. And just to kind of focus it as we are completing, just as a way of sort of a checklist, how to be the best you are for these interviews. Prepare yourself, research, know about what's going on with the firm and the position. Know yourself, know what you want to talk about in terms of your strengths and perhaps even some of your weaknesses. Pace yourself, particularly if you have all-day interviews or you say you're traveling out of town, perhaps give yourself some rest, get there a day early. Read the interviewer, really be aware of this other person and their energy and their needs and their timetable. Listen more than you talk. Engage, and by this I mean the rapport building, and close. And by close I mean get an offer.